Some tombs were built to honor the dead. These were not. Look at these doors. Massive slabs of granite fused to the surrounding bedrock, showing no seam, no handle, no path forward. They were never meant to be opened. They were built to be forgotten. Across the globe, we find corridors blocked by tons of masonry, burial chambers buried beneath intentional, calculated deception. Why would a civilization expend such immense effort to seal a space so completely? We are not talking about simple graves. We are looking at fortresses of memory, designed with a singular, chilling purpose: to keep the world out. The precision of these stone plugs defies the technology of their time. They are silent, heavy, and absolute. The architects knew exactly what they were doing. What were they so desperate to hide? Welcome to Dark Future Archive. I am your guide through the remnants of history that refuse to be understood. Today, we move beyond the surface of these sealed sites to investigate the architecture of silence. We are not looking for ghosts, curses, or the sensational claims that haunt the fringes of archaeology. We are looking for the logic of the threshold. A sealed tomb is a message left by the living, a boundary drawn in stone to separate our world from the next, or perhaps to keep the past from bleeding into the present. Every angle of these chambers, every block of stone placed with deliberate, crushing weight, serves a function. It is a language of exclusion. By studying the floor plans and the geometry of these sites, we begin to see how architects manipulated the movement of the living to protect the dead. We are here to decode that language. We are here to understand why a society would choose to erase its own history behind layers of masonry. It is time to step across the line and confront the silence of the stone. To understand why these structures exist, we must look past the stone and into the intent of the builders. Throughout history, the act of sealing a tomb served a dual purpose. On one level, it was a practical defense, a calculated effort to secure the royal body against the inevitable greed of looters. Architects designed these barriers to withstand time and force, creating a physical deterrent that was meant to endure for centuries. Yet, this is only the surface of the logic. To close a tomb was also a spiritual necessity, a final act of ritual completion. In many cultures, the degree of closure went far beyond the standard requirements of burial. It was an attempt to finalize a transition, to ensure that the occupant had safely crossed from the world of the living into the next. The ceiling was not just a lock. It was a boundary of cosmic order. The tomb was a vessel for the dead, but the seal was a message to the living, declaring that the occupant was under divine protection. Nowhere is this architecture of exclusion more evident than in the hidden shafts of the Old Kingdom. Here, the builders moved beyond the simple wall. They began to treat the interior of the tomb as a puzzle, a labyrinth designed to misdirect and exhaust any intruder. Architects constructed elaborate false paths, carving corridors that led deep into the bedrock only to terminate in solid, impenetrable masonry. These were not mistakes of design. They were deliberate acts of deception. A false door, etched into the limestone, served as a psychological barrier, a lie told to the future to suggest a passage where none existed. When an intruder breached the outer perimeter, they were met with a series of dead ends and vertical shafts that dropped into nothingness. These designs reveal a society deeply anxious about the permanence of its own legacy. By manipulating the movement of the living, the architects ensured that the true burial chamber remained a ghost within the structure. Every turn in the corridor, every false lead, was a calculated attempt to exhaust the curiosity of the grave robber. The tomb was a machine of stone built to keep the past buried. Beyond the deceptive labyrinths of the Nile, the architecture of silence took a more brutal, physical form in the Mediterranean. Here, the focus shifted from the puzzle to the immovable object. We see this in the massive stone plugs, blocks of granite and limestone weighing several tons, dropped into place with such mechanical precision that they appear to fuse with the surrounding bedrock. These were not merely doors, they were geological interventions. To seal a chamber, architects carved vertical shafts directly into the path, lowering these colossal monoliths until they locked the corridor in a permanent, stone-on-stone grip. There is no latch to pick, no false wall to bypass. The sheer mass of the material denies entry by force of physics alone. We have found these plugs, still seated in their original positions, untouched for millennia, their surfaces smoothed to a degree that defies the primitive tools of their era. They represent a total rejection of the future, a finality that requires no trickery to enforce. The silence of these chambers is the weight of stone, holding the past in a grip that time has failed to break. These sites are not merely graves, they are fortresses of memory. When we move past the mechanics of the seal, we encounter a deeper intent, the construction of a permanent, unyielding monument. The tomb becomes a vessel for the occupant, designed to survive the collapse of dynasties and the shifting tides of public opinion. Architects reached for a scale that transcended the individual, using massive masonry to anchor the memory of the dead into the very landscape. This is the architecture of the static. By creating these heavy, impenetrable volumes, they sought to arrest the flow of history itself. The tomb stands as a declaration that the past is not a fluid concept, but a fixed point in the physical world. We see this in the deliberate, monumental weight of the structures, where every block of stone serves as a sentinel against the erosion of time. They were built to ensure that the occupant remained a constant, even as the world outside changed. This is the ultimate defensive strategy, to turn the burial site into a landmark so imposing that it forces the future to acknowledge the past. The tomb does not just hold the dead, it commands the space around it, demanding a silence that is both physical and historical. It is a fortress built to hold a legacy. Nowhere is this architectural desperation more visible than in the Valley of the Kings. Here, the strategy shifted from mere obstruction to active, lethal defense. Engineers moved beyond simple stone plugs, designing layered barriers that turned the tomb's own structure into a weapon. We find corridors riddled with hidden shafts, designed to drop the unwary into darkness, and massive stone slabs suspended by ropes, waiting to be triggered by the slightest disturbance. These were not just walls, they were kinetic traps. If an intruder managed to breach the initial outer gate, they faced a sequence of secondary chambers where the ceiling itself was engineered to collapse, sealing the path behind them and burying the passage in tons of rubble. This was a calculated, extreme response to the threat of desecration. The builders understood that a royal body required more than a stone box. It required a tomb that could fight back. By layering these barriers, they created a gauntlet of stone and gravity, ensuring that the sanctity of the royal occupant remained undisturbed. They were willing to destroy the architecture itself to keep the interior hidden. The physical traps were only the first layer of a much larger defensive strategy. Beyond the falling stones and hidden shafts, these tombs functioned as psychological instruments designed to break the resolve of anyone who dared to enter. The architects understood that a thief could be stopped by a wall, but a trespasser had to be stopped by fear. Every narrow, suffocating passage was a deliberate choice, forcing the intruder to move in a state of constant, heightened tension. The geometry of these spaces was not just for structural support. It was a visual language of intimidation. As one descended deeper, the environment became increasingly oppressive, designed to signal that the occupant was under the protection of something far greater than masonry. These were divine warnings cast in stone. The sheer scale of the effort required to seal these chambers served as a constant reminder that the boundary was not merely a physical obstacle, but a sacred line that could not be crossed without consequence. The stakes of these burials extended far beyond the preservation of a body or the protection of gold. To the ancient mind, the tomb was a critical component of the cosmic clockwork, a station where the dead performed their role in the maintenance of existence. When an intruder breached these walls, they were not just stealing property. They were committing a profound violation of the cosmic order. The architecture was designed to prevent this spiritual catastrophe. Every seal, every hidden door, and every false passage functioned as a metaphysical lock, holding the fabric of the afterlife in place. If that seal were broken, the consequences were believed to be absolute. The intruder became a catalyst for chaos, a force that threatened to unravel the connection between the living and the divine. This explains the extreme, almost irrational efforts taken to ensure complete closure. The builders were not merely guarding a chamber, they were defending the stability of the universe. The intrusion was viewed as a rupture in the natural world, a tear in the veil that separated order from entropy. Yet, we must look beyond the divine. There is a darker side to this architecture, one where the stone does not protect, but suppresses. In these instances, the sealing of a tomb was not a ritual of honor, but a desperate act of erasure. The music shifts here, losing its reverent tone and taking on a colder, more clinical edge. When we find chambers sealed with a violence that defies standard burial practices, we are no longer looking at a sanctuary. We are looking at a prison. Fear becomes the primary architect. Fear of contamination, fear of a disgraced ruler, or the frantic need to excise a memory from the public consciousness. When a dynasty collapsed, the tombs of its predecessors were often not merely looted, they were ritually entombed to prevent the return of their influence. The architecture of exclusion is a language of its own, and it speaks of a society deeply anxious about the permanence of its own legacy. These seals were not meant to keep the living out, but to keep the past from bleeding into the present. The stone was meant to hold back a history that the living could no longer afford to remember. Consider the tombs where the air itself feels heavy, as if the space has been scrubbed of life to contain a lingering rot. This is the architecture of contagion. In these sites, the sealing process was not a final farewell, but a quarantine. Builders used layers of lime, thick clay, and massive unhewn boulders to ensure that whatever resided within remained isolated. It is a palpable, physical rejection. You can see it in the way the masonry crowds the entrance, as if the stone itself is trying to push the chamber back into the earth. There is a sense of urgency in the construction, a frantic precision that suggests the architects were not merely closing a door, but cauterizing a wound. They feared the influence of the occupant, not as a political entity, but as a source of corruption that could seep through the cracks. Every block placed, every gap filled with mortar, was a deliberate effort to stifle a presence that refused to stay quiet. Beyond the fear of rot, there lies a more calculated malice, the architecture of the disgraced. When a ruler fell from grace, their tomb was transformed from a monument into a cage. This was not about protecting the dead, but about ensuring they remained a prisoner of their own history. We see this in the deliberate, systematic defacement of wall carvings, where names were chiseled away and faces were hacked from the stone. The architects were ordered to seal these chambers with a finality that bordered on hatred. They used heavy, irregular blocks to obstruct doorways, creating a structural barrier that served as an eternal gag. Every inch of masonry was designed to silence the occupant. It was a cold, architectural shaming. The goal was to render the occupant invisible to the future, to bury their deeds so deep that the earth itself would forget they ever existed. The stone serves as a jailer, holding the past in a grip that no amount of time can loosen. When a dynasty collapses, the silence that follows is rarely peaceful. It is a violent, structural rejection of everything that came before. The transition from power to oblivion happens in the blink of an eye, and the tombs of the former rulers become the primary targets of this new, desperate order. The sealing process changes instantly. It is no longer about reverence or even simple containment. It is about total, ritualized erasure. You see this in the frantic, haphazard way the entrances are blocked. Massive, mismatched stones are dragged into place, not with the precision of a master architect, but with the raw, muscular force of a mob. The goal is to kill the lingering influence of the predecessor before it can take root in the new regime. Every slab of rock is a nail in the coffin of a legacy. This is the architecture of panic, where the living scramble to wall off the past, terrified that if a single crack remains, the old power might bleed back into the present. They seal these chambers with such finality that the tomb becomes a vacuum, a place where history is not just stored, but actively strangled. The dynasty is gone, and the stone is the only thing left to ensure it never returns. The erasure begins with sound. A rhythmic, metallic ringing echoes through the burial chamber as iron chisels strike the limestone walls. This is not a slow decay. It is an active, violent stripping of identity. The workers move with a singular, destructive focus. They target the cartouches first, the sacred symbols that hold the ruler's name. With every strike, a fragment of the past turns to dust. They do not stop at the names. They move to the faces carved into the pillars, hacking away eyes, noses, and lips, until the stone figures are reduced to featureless, smooth surfaces. It is a systematic process of depersonification. The air fills with fine, white powder, coating the floor and the tools alike. Each blow is deliberate, intended to sever the connection. The intricate, beautiful reliefs that once told a story of divine right are now scarred, jagged wounds in the architecture. The identity of the occupant has been successfully unmade, leaving behind only the cold, indifferent stone of an empty legacy. Once the identity is stripped away, the final stage of erasure begins. The workers abandon their tools and turn to the heavy masonry. This is the architecture of absolute finality. They drag massive stone blocks into the corridor, fitting them with a precision that suggests they never intend for these doors to be breached again. The sound changes from the sharp ring of metal to the deep, grinding thud of rock against rock. It is a slow, relentless process. One by one, the gaps are filled. The light from the outside world is gradually choked off, shrinking the space until the darkness is total. There is no room for error, and there is no room for return. The living are not just burying a body, they are burying a memory so deep that it ceases to exist. They pile rubble against the exterior, smoothing the surface until the entrance is indistinguishable from the surrounding cliff face. The tomb is no longer a monument. It is a secret, a void, a place that has been surgically removed from the map of history. The seal holds, the living have spoken, and the stone has obeyed. The boundary is absolute, and the occupant has been erased from the possibility of discovery. The architecture of exclusion is a language of its own, written in angles, depths, and dead ends. When we map the floor plans of these sites, we are not looking at simple graves. We are looking at a weaponized geometry. Every corridor is a calculated decision. Every turn is a deliberate obstruction. Architects of the ancient world did not merely build to contain. They built to manipulate the movement of the living. They understood that the human mind seeks patterns, and they used that instinct to lead the intruder astray. By studying these layouts, we see how space was weaponized against the future. The floor plan acts as a filter, separating the intended path from the forbidden. It is a rigid, unforgiving system where the walls themselves dictate where a person can stand and where they are forced to stop. This is a dialogue between the architect and the potential intruder, a silent negotiation where the tomb holds all the leverage. The structure is a physical manifestation of an anxious society, a blueprint designed to ensure that the secrets buried within remain untouched. The most insidious element of this architecture is the false door. It is a masterpiece of deception, carved into the stone with such meticulous detail that it mimics the reality of an entrance. It features lintels, doorposts, and even simulated hinges, all designed to lure the eye and command the attention of the intruder. But it is a lie. It is a solid slab of rock that leads nowhere. When a thief approaches, the false door promises a path to the interior, directing their focus toward a point of absolute resistance. It is a psychological trap, a way to waste the time and energy of those who dare to disturb the silence. The architect knew exactly how the human mind would react to such a visual cue. By creating this illusion, they manipulated the intruder into a state of confusion, forcing them to search for a seam that does not exist. This is not just a barrier. It is a distortion of reality. It traps the curious in a cycle of futility, ensuring that the true path remains hidden behind the very wall that claims to be an opening. These elaborate deceptions reveal more than just technical skill. They expose a society deeply anxious about the permanence of its own legacy. When we look past the stone, we see a culture obsessed with the fragility of memory. Every hidden shaft and every reinforced block of masonry serves as a frantic attempt to anchor their existence against the inevitable erosion of time. This was not merely about protecting the dead. It was a desperate bid to dictate how they would be perceived by the generations that followed. The architects were not just building tombs. They were constructing a bulwark against oblivion. They operated under the constant, gnawing fear that their history could be erased, their names forgotten, or their achievements dismantled by those who came after. This anxiety is etched into the very foundation of these sites. It is a profound, structural insecurity that forced them to go to extreme lengths, turning burial into a performance of absolute control. By creating these impenetrable barriers, they were attempting to freeze their reality in place, hoping that if they could keep the past perfectly sealed, they might somehow guarantee their own immortality. Yet, the very existence of these massive, complex defenses proves their failure. The architecture remains a testament to their fear, a silent monument to a society that tried to outmaneuver the future and lost. Now we reach the threshold where defense ends and total rejection begins. There are sites where the builders did not merely hide the entrance, they sought to delete the tomb from the physical world entirely. These are the extreme cases of finality, where the architecture serves as a deliberate barrier against the very concept of discovery. Imagine a corridor filled not with traps, but with solid, monolithic stone, placed with such crushing weight that the chamber behind it ceases to be a space and becomes a void. This is not a grave. It is a permanent erasure. In these instances, the seal is so absolute that it rejects the presence of the living, effectively turning the site into a non-entity. When we stand before these barriers, we are not looking at a challenge to be solved, but a boundary that demands total withdrawal. The architects achieved a level of closure that makes the tomb invisible to the historical record, a silent defiance that has lasted millennia. They did not want their work to be found. They wanted the past to remain unreachable, locked away in a state of perpetual, undisturbed darkness. As we move through these chapters, we must acknowledge the hard limits of our understanding. Archaeology is a precise craft, capable of mapping the how of a tomb's construction with startling clarity. We can measure the weight of the stone, analyze the composition of the mortar, and trace the geometry of the hidden shafts. Yet, when we confront a site closed with such finality, we hit a wall that no excavation can bypass. We know the mechanics of the seal, but the motive remains locked behind the masonry. Why did they choose this specific, absolute form of closure? Was it a ritual requirement, a political necessity, or a desperate act of erasure? The evidence provides data, but it refuses to provide context. We are left staring at the stone, forced to confront the vast, empty gaps in our historical record. The silence of these chambers is not an absence of information. It is a deliberate obstruction. Every tool we bring only confirms the same truth. Some secrets were never intended for us to decipher. We are left with the weight of the stone. There is a specific weight to the silence found within these sealed chambers. It is not merely the absence of sound, but a heavy, pressing presence that fills the air. When you stand before a wall of stone that has remained undisturbed for thousands of years, the atmosphere changes. The air feels thinner, charged with the static of a secret that refuses to be shared. We look at these surfaces and see more than just rock. We see a boundary that has successfully resisted the passage of time. The stone does not offer answers. It does not yield to the light of our modern technology. Instead, it seems to absorb our questions, leaving us with nothing but the cold, unyielding texture of the masonry. There is a profound discomfort in this realization. We are trained to believe that everything can be uncovered, but these tombs stand as a direct contradiction. The silence is not passive. It is an active, deliberate state of being. It is a warning that echoes across the centuries. In the end, we must look past the stone and see the hand that placed it. A sealed tomb is not a natural phenomenon, nor is it merely a relic of grief. It is a testament to the power of the living. When a civilization commits to the labor of sealing a chamber with such finality, they are performing a definitive act of control. They are not just burying a body. They are dictating the terms of memory. Every block of masonry, every hidden shaft, and every false corridor serves a singular, calculated purpose: to ensure that the past remains exactly where the living decided it should stay. This is the architecture of authority. It is a way to command the future, forcing those who come later to interact with the site on the terms set by the deceased or their survivors. By closing the door, they assert their right to define what is remembered and what is erased. We often mistake this closure for a lack of narrative, but it is the opposite. It is a story told in the most absolute language possible, the language of exclusion. The tomb becomes a fortress of the ego, a place where the living project their will across the centuries, ensuring that their version of history remains undisturbed by the curiosity of the future. The seal is not a failure of communication. It is the final word. To seal a tomb is to curate the future. It is a calculated manipulation of what remains, a way to ensure that only the desired narrative survives the erosion of time. When the living block an entrance with tons of stone, they are not just protecting a body, they are editing the historical record. They decide which aspects of a life are worthy of preservation and which must be consigned to oblivion. This is the ultimate exercise in historical revisionism. In some instances, we find that the sealing was not an act of reverence, but an act of erasure. By blocking access to a ruler's final resting place, a dynasty could effectively delete a predecessor. They turned the tomb into a void, a space where memory was meant to wither and die. The architecture of these sites reflects this intent. False doors lead the curious into empty chambers, while hidden shafts ensure that the true history remains inaccessible. It is a language of deception written in bedrock. We see how geometry was used to manipulate the movement of those who might come later, forcing them to encounter only the version of the past that the architects allowed. By closing the door, they did not just bury the dead, they silenced them, ensuring that their influence would not bleed into the present, effectively freezing history. Yet, as we peel back the layers of these stone barriers, we encounter a chilling reality. The most disturbing tombs are not those overflowing with gold, nor those that promise the discovery of lost dynasties. The true weight of the past is felt in the sites that feel like a warning. When we stand before a chamber sealed with such primal intensity, we are not witnessing a desire to protect treasure. We are witnessing a desire to contain something that the living feared. These are the thresholds that seem to push back against the intruder. They do not invite us to marvel at their craftsmanship. They demand that we turn away. There is a palpable difference between a tomb designed to preserve a legacy and one constructed to quarantine a memory. In the latter, the architecture itself feels defensive, almost hostile. The heavy, immovable stones, the deliberate lack of ornamentation, and the sheer, suffocating finality of the closure create an atmosphere of dread. We are forced to confront the possibility that some things were never meant to be found, and that the most effective architecture is the one that successfully keeps the past exactly where it was intended to stay. Now, we stand directly before the stone. The air here is different, cooler, pulled from the depths of the earth itself. Reach out and press a palm against the surface. The rock is not smooth. It is rough, scarred by the tools of those who placed it here thousands of years ago. It is immovable. There is no give, no vibration, no sound escaping from the void behind it. Look at the seams. They are so tight that a blade could not find purchase. This is not mere construction. This is a deliberate rejection of the outside world. The sheer mass of the masonry dwarfs us, reminding us of our own fleeting presence compared to the permanence of this seal. We are looking at a wall that has successfully resisted the curiosity of ages. The dust gathers in the crevices, undisturbed. There is a specific, heavy stillness that clings to this place, a physical pressure that makes the pulse quicken. The boundary holds. It does not yield to the light, nor to our questions. It remains a silent, impenetrable monument. Time has eroded empires, toppled statues, and reclaimed cities, yet these seals remain. We bring our scanners, our drills, and our theories, but the stone does not acknowledge our presence. It is a testament to an engineering of exclusion that has outlasted the very civilizations that commissioned it. Consider the logic of the threshold once more. It was never meant to be a door. It was meant to be an end. When we walk away from these sites, we leave behind a mystery that refuses to be solved. The silence we encountered at the entrance is not a vacuum, but a deliberate, constructed state. It is a boundary that holds firm against the relentless pressure of the present. The secrets are held in place by the weight of the masonry. The seal is not a failure of access, but a triumph of intent. The boundary holds, and the archive closes. There is a lingering sensation here, a weight that settles in the chest long after the eyes have turned away. It is the realization that we are not merely observing history. We are standing in the presence of a deliberate, calculated silence. These tombs were not built for us to find. They were built to ensure that certain things would remain exactly where they were placed, hidden from the reach of time and the prying hands of the living. To stand before such a seal is to feel the sharp edge of an ancient warning. It is a quiet, profound unease that suggests some secrets were never meant to be unearthed, and some boundaries were drawn with a finality that demands our respect. We look at the stone and recognize the success of the architect. The design has functioned perfectly for millennia, keeping the interior world untouched, and the past safely contained. We are left with a sense of awe, not for the treasures that might lie within, but for the sheer power of an intent that has survived the rise and fall of countless generations. Some things are meant to stay buried, and as we retreat, the silence feels like a choice. The data is archived, the maps are filed. Yet, the core of the mystery remains untouched by our efforts. We have spent this time tracing the lines of stone and the geometry of exclusion, but we are ultimately left with the same silence we encountered at the start. It is a silence that does not invite us in, but rather dictates the terms of our departure. As we turn our backs on these thresholds, we acknowledge the limits of our own reach. Some stories were never intended to be told. Some spaces were never meant to be illuminated. The architecture of the tomb is a language of absolute separation, and it has spoken clearly. We leave the past to its own devices, secure behind its massive, unyielding barriers. The light of our investigation dims, receding into the vast, quiet history that these structures were built to protect. There is no final discovery here, only the profound realization that the seal has held. The boundary between our world and the next remains unbroken, and the secrets of the dead stay exactly where they were placed. We close the archive now, leaving the stones to their eternal, undisturbed vigil. The investigation ends, the lights fade, and the silence returns to claim the space once more. Everything is as it was, and as it will remain.